Welcome back to Preserving Our Past, Informing Our Future. I'm Sydney Stevenson, coming to you from the School of Occupational Therapy at Texas Women's University. Today's episode focuses on occupational therapy education, how it began, how it has changed, and what questions have remained surprisingly consistent over time. Dr. Reed brings a unique perspective to this conversation. Before coming to TWU, she founded the occupational therapy program at the University of Oklahoma, building a curriculum from the ground up while also studying the profession's earliest training programs. Her work has traced the evolution of occupational therapy education from its earliest days, including the war emergency courses to the complex systems of accreditation and credentialing we see today. Through her experiences, we can begin to understand not only what has changed in OT education, but also the enduring tensions that continue to shape how we prepare future practitioners. Today, we explore what it means to educate an occupational therapist, how those expectations have evolved, and what evolution tells us about the profession itself. Dr. Reed, welcome back. So, you founded the OT program at the University of Oklahoma before eventually coming to Texas. What was it like to build an OT program from the ground up, and what principles guided you?
This is another example of where the best laid plans of mice and men went astray. When I was first hired, I had about 3 months before I was supposed to report. So I put together what I considered to be a state of the art occupational therapy educational program based on the best practices that I was aware of and had experienced at the University of Washington OT program. Then reality hit. When I got the list of the therapists who were living in Oklahoma at the time, only about 12 out of the I don't remember the exact number anymore, were actually practicing, and when I looked at the facilities in which they were practicing, there were only 3 that I could, determine seemed to be practicing OT reasonably at the state-of-the-art, um, process. So, I took my grand plan, put it in file 13, and started over. It was evident that the practice of OT was frankly not up to par, that what was called occupational therapy, particularly in nursing homes, was a pottery class, which you could have removed from the nursing home and put on Main Street, and people would have been happy to come in and make some mostly slip type pottery. So it was more a recreational activity, something to keep residents busy, and whatever therapeutic potential it had to be it had to be in the mind of the resident because the person who ran the program was either a nursing aide or somebody who actually ran a pottery program somewhere in the community. So that knocked out the largest percentage of the so-called OT programs. Then there were immediately when I started the program, we got calls from people saying, "Oh, we really would like to have an occupational therapist. We want to keep our patients busy." So obviously, the major problem to start out with was getting some sort of understanding of what OT really was. That meant that some of our students actually were going to be doing their field work in places that had the name occupational therapy on the door somewhere, and that's about the extent. So I was really concerned initially. Some of the students we were able to send out of state, and we had contacts with programs that, were of good quality to go out of state. And we had to do something about increasing the quality of OT in the state. So we had very frank discussions with some of the students that basically They were going to be working with us almost more than with somebody at the facility to upgrade the quality of the OT program at that facility that they were going to be building, and that hopefully then they would be able to use that experience to help upgrade some of the other programs in the state. It did work, but it was a very interesting and challenging process to realize that the quality of OT services was so uneven across the country at that point, and that we were in the middle of it. When just south of the border in Denton was a thriving OT educational program.
Mhm.
So, it was definitely a learning experience. I was certainly able to use that to advantage in talking about the development of programs. And when we went for accreditation, one of the first things I said is whatever material we submit needs to be available to anyone who wants to use it. Prior to that, the materials that were sent in for accreditation were considered to be private property, only to be used by the accreditation people for the purpose of the accreditation or reaccreditation process. And my immediate reaction was, we are all in this together. And if anything that I've put together in terms of our accreditation materials can be of any assistance to anybody else, please have at it. And hopefully, then, as other programs became accredited, that they would have the same open philosophy. And so the accreditation process would become its own building process for the educational programs. Basic principles was to try to put together a good foundation. Another problem that existed was that the quality of the experiences that the students had had, even though this was an undergraduate program, their high school biology class, for example, consisted of dissecting crickets. Now, I admit crickets are living creatures, but their anatomy and physiology is a little different than ours. The students came to us with transcripts that on the surface looked okay until you started really looking at what was the content of those classes. And you realized we were going to be doing some remedial work in the basic science classes, as well as trying to upgrade the quality of the OT. Initial grand plans pretty well bit the dust. Of course, OT was much more developed in Texas, but rarely were students sent for their field work in Oklahoma, and I can well understand why that was so. The two programs in Tulsa and the one in Oklahoma City that had occasionally had a student, and otherwise, that was another thing. Fieldwork sites that take students, while it does add to the workload, it also adds to the ongoing development of that OT program. That was one of the things, of course, I had to explain repeatedly to facilities. Was we're not very anxious to take OT students. They all thought they were up to their necks in work to start with. Yet they wanted to expand their rehab services, and I said, well, the one of the best ways to do that in this state is to take students from our program because some of them will then become your employees. And if you think you're going to get a lot of people from out of state when they can see the quality of the OT services in the state of Oklahoma, that we are going to have to from within. And of course, this was true, not only was Denton just to our south, but the University of Kansas program, where I had my training, was just to our north. Neither of those OT programs were very anxious to send students to Oklahoma at that point.
Mhm.
Now it's much better, but also we have, there's a program in Arkansas, so there are a lot more educational programs around now.
Dr. Reed, you have studied the pioneer schools of occupation extensively. When you compare those early curricula to what students experience today, what has genuinely changed and what has remained remarkably consistent?
Yeah, of course, the pioneer programs, many of them which were Reconstruction aid programs, were glorified craft classes because that's what was expected. Um, they vary. Well, some of them were as short as 6 weeks. Others went, a few months. But basically, they were designed to either teach or help brush up people's skills in craft activities. Pottery, weaving, needlecraft, leatherwork, woodworking were probably the major things. Some of them did manage to get in an hour or two on hospital ethics, or maybe an hour on what, and of course, the history of OT wasn't very long back then.
Hmm.
Didn't take very long to teach what was available. But of course, many of these courses had no access to anyone who claimed to be an OT, let alone having had any experience actually working in an OT setting. So what most of them learned was basically arts and crafts and probably learned how to cope with the facilities when they got there. Most of the, of course, the reconstruction aid programs dissolved when World War One ended. So they only existed for anywhere from 6 months to maybe a year and a half. And of those, only four survived for any length of time in the States. And then the one in Toronto. When the accreditation process first started in the early 30s, uh, there was a list of 13 programs that claimed to be offering some sort of OT education, of which 11 actually were reviewed. And again, of those, only four in the U.S. survived: the Boston School, the Philadelphia School, the St. Louis School, and Milwaukee Downer. And notice I said school, not university, except for everything except Milwaukee Downer. Milwaukee Downer was the only one that was a university-based program and had been from the beginning. The other three were started as private schools. And it wasn't until the 1949, what are called the essentials, of accredited program, and for the occupational therapist, we're ahead of the certified OT assistant our history until 1958. Um, so the essentials in 49 made it clear that the schools of occupational therapy needed to find a university system which they could join. And so Boston School joined Tufts, Philadelphia School joined University of Pennsylvania. And from then on, well, the next school was when I was at Western Michigan University, which of course originally was the Kalamazoo School of OT, and again was at a state hospital. And so as soon as it became accredited, its next job was to find a university and a college to join. And so that's how it ended up at Western Michigan. When the essentials were first put together in draft form in 1933 and then adopted in 1935, put together what is still basically the blueprint. We've adjusted the drawings, but the basic blueprint remains the same. They're biological, social sciences, the theoretical basis of OT in its various uh, iterations, and the technical activities, which include crafts, arts and crafts, but that has become a very minor portion of the program now. So the pioneer schools probably did not add a lot to our development of a curriculum in OT. But once we started with the accreditation process, we have, as said, maintained that core ideas. And those core ideas really did come to us through social work. Eleanor Clark Slagle did understand the relative importance of that sort of three-legged stool approach to a curriculum.
All right. So going back a little bit to the reconstruction aids and the war emergency courses, they're a really fascinating chapter to me. They were shorter programs created just to meet wartime demand. Do you see any parallels between that tension and current debates about entry level requirements?
The war emergency students were mostly college graduates. In fact, the prerequisites were that they be college graduates. It turned out a few people probably slipped through who, for one reason or other, had taken college classes but hadn't formally graduated. So that's a big difference, because we're talking basically 1944. So we're still talking about OT as being an undergraduate program. So the students who went through the war emergency classes were, for the most part, going to be a little bit older. And for the most part, they would have had a college education. And they had preference for those who had gone through courses that tended to relate to OT. So we're back to art majors, home ec majors, maybe a few people with psychology. So the fact that the program was 4 months of basically theory and 8 months of field work, as we know it now, it cannot be equated with the standards that the rest of the population had to accept. Also, the field work was in the army hospitals because that's what they were trying, to push. Okay. So working in an army hospital is different than working in a civilian hospital. There are just a lot more rules and regulations about what they could and couldn't do. Obviously, they were living on base, wherever their training was, they were living on that army base. So they were not getting any exposure to civilian hospitals. And so it was a very insular type program with very specific structure. Again, just like the Reconstruction aids in World War One, when World War II ended, many of the women returned to their families and did not continue. The quality of the instruction, I think, was quite high because it was developed by the existing OT programs. So they they got a very intense 4 months. Now, as you know, one can sit in class and learn a lot, or one can sit in class and not learn a whole lot. But it appears that, this was wartime. So if they had volunteered to participate, they were either in it to stay, or they very quickly realized they were in over their head and withdrew. So we have the only carry through of that program was that some of our educational programs for a number of years did offer what was called advanced standing OT program, in which the admission standard was that the person had a college degree prior to entry. And then the course of study varied quite a bit. Some programs, essentially the advanced standing students and the undergrads were pretty much all in the same class, but there would be slightly different requirements in terms of finishing that class. Others operated separate classes for advanced standing. When we went to the master's level entry, the advanced standing didn't make any sense anymore, so that was the end of that. So, by 2007, when everybody had to move to a master's level, advanced standing courses no longer existed. There was no point to them. The only thing that remains is therapists who finished their program, graduated, and passed the exam, and might have worked for a year or so, and then left the field for family reasons. Now that the kids are teenagers, they want to return to practice, partly because the money would certainly help the family. And if they're going to send those kids to college, a few extra bucks was going to be needed. However, they've now been out of practice for 10 or 12 years. And so various educational programs have occasionally offered refresher courses. And we tried in the early 70s to put together a refresher course outline. Others have found it more useful to get a job as an OT aide in and essentially learn on the job. And as they gain skills, they could then transfer back up to a staff OT position, or in some cases, an OTA position, if that's the credentials they had. And so the war emergency contributed some ideas about how to condense some education, which we may be using. Once the master's level entry came on, It shifted everything. And yes, the courses that had been available over a 4-year period using a typical undergraduate uh, program got condensed, and the breadth of education depends a great deal. Again, what I remember most from being on the admissions programs here at TWU when we were at that master's level entry is that some of the undergraduate transcripts looked like the high school transcripts that I had seen in Oklahoma.
Hmm.
So we're back to dissecting crickets. What had passed as basic anatomy and physiology, the anatomy was comparative, basically. Yes, there was a little human anatomy in there somewhere, but mostly we got dogs, cats, and horses, which is better than crickets, but still meant that we had to watch the course descriptions. Looking at the transcript was a good start, but a lousy finish. And when the catalogs became available online, it was a great help, yeah,
Hmm.
because we could see what the course content appeared to actually include and help students adjust accordingly. When I was in Oklahoma, we were very interested in promoting what we now call DEI. It was just the inclusion program at that point, non discrimination. And again, what we found is that there were students whose grades looked excellent. But when you started working down to what were they actually getting in that education? It was sad. Oklahoma required that schools have certified teachers, but in small communities, they did not exist.
Really?
Oklahoma has a number of freeman towns that were put together by freed slaves. And you're lucky if they have a high school. Their educational program usually stopped at 8th or ninth grade, and then the students had to go to some neighboring town to finish high school. Or if they had their own high school, they were hard put together teaching faculty of certified teachers mostly. So they had a certified teacher, of a staff of 7 or 8 or 9 people. And so much of, again, the problem was filling in behind. And I would guess if you talk to the faculty about, particularly those that are on the admissions committee, and say, what do you see in the overall admissions? Now, where we have large applicant pools, you know what happened to those people who came from high schools that are not up to par. They simply fell to the bottom of the list. And we were trying to cope with some of that in Oklahoma. And I admit, some of the remedial programs that the university offered, that list sat on my desk
Hmm.
for ready referral because we had people who they at home they spoke not a foreign language. They spoke the fractured English language. So when they were trying to write progress notes, sometimes it did not look a lot like English. And we knew if they got out in the field work and they wrote notes like that, the facilities were not going to be pleased. So we had to refer them for remedial English. Making up for the biology classes or physiology anatomy classes required us to adjust, but we were not English teachers. We also had students whose reading rate was so low. Um, that even if you only assigned them 10 pages of reading, they were struggling to get through. And if you assigned them, if the chapter was 20 pages, forget it. They were not going to be, it wasn't for lack of trying, it was lack of reading speed and comprehension. And so we frequently had to review the written material before an exam to make sure that they had at least caught some of the pertinent points. Now, I said I haven't taught a course where I had to assign large pages. I've done some fill-in teaching, but it's usually the media classes, which nobody else wants to teach. So I have filled in teaching media classes. But I think if you talk to the faculty, you may learn a little bit about what are they hitting as sort of missing pieces in what we think we want as background before students enter the program and what we're actually getting. And it'll be most acute in the first year because that's where you either fill in or it's going to be really bad news the second year. So, well, we're sort of at that point of where I started with the curriculum when I started the program in Oklahoma. Every educational program has in its accreditation materials what it wants to get done. There's probably a perceivable gap between what the printed or most of it's now submitted electronically. What the idealized program is, whether it's in print or electronic, and what is actually getting done. And your fieldwork people will very quickly tell you where they see the gaps.
Mhm.
And some of that is inherent, I think, but some of it is real. In some cases, students were taught the material, but they were taught it in a format that's slightly different than the fieldwork supervisor wants to use it. And so it isn't that they don't know it; it's that they don't know it quite in the format that the supervisor would like it used. That to me is supervisors simply have to learn to recognize that. There isn't time to teach the same thing 3 different ways, so they're stuck with, bridging that gap. But there are missing units. They're either not there or they're there in such a limited fashion that they really don't meet the expectations of the fieldwork site. That's an ongoing struggle.
So, going back to educational standards, which we have talked about a little bit, they have been shaped by AOTA, the AMA, and now 8 Coat. What has been the most significant milestones in credentialing, and how have they strengthened or complicated the profession?
Of course, our first attempt to come up with a systematic approach to educational programming for OT is 1923. That's the original minimum standards. Okay, that we did on our own. That is our predecessors, and that got revised in 1930. And so those 2 attempts were all through AOTA. Then in '33, we first began to hook up with AMA, and there were really 2 outstanding rationales. We needed we needed their clout. We also needed their money.
Mhm.
As I said, there were technically 13 programs that needed to be looked at, 11 of which were looked at. There was no way that AOTA had the budget to do that, to send 2 people out. So the first essentials were adopted in 1935, but the schools then did not have to meet the requirements until 1938. And then that's the first 5, 4 in the US and University of Toronto. And then the Kalamazoo School, Western Michigan, became the 6th. The next revision was in 1943. Basically, that's the one that set up the fieldwork in these different areas of practice, which we've now considered not a useful approach. And basically, that's continued through until 65, had that breakdown of different categories of fieldwork practice. The 1949 essentials are the ones that basically required that OT programs not be freestanding. What was evident in that freestanding approach was, okay, there's always 2 sides. Yeah, they certainly had the freedom to do whatever they wanted, but they frequently didn't have the funds to do it. And they didn't have the capacity to pull together the faculty to teach those basic courses, let alone the curriculum in OT. So thereafter, we became university based, and that was way ahead of PT because when I was helping work on school-based practice. In the 1970s in the state of Washington, there was still a PT program in Los Angeles Hospital. And so we pulled ahead from that standpoint. Then we got rid of that breakdown by different hospitals and got back to, what is fundamental about OT. And then, of course, the essentials of uh, we stopped using the essentials because we stopped working with AMA in 1994, and ACOTE became the accrediting agency with the U.S. Department of Education on our backs. It was an interesting time then. We no longer had CAHIA, which was the medical group at that point that was working with us, trying to shape us and saying that curriculum director had to be a physician. And of course, we were pretty much of the idea that it should be an OT. So we were not on the same page that direction. And that all the medical lectures had to be by docs. We were not all together tied to that idea either. So we got out from underneath them and they redid their whole accrediting process, only to discover that the U.S. Department of Education had some ideas about how all college education or university type education had to be done. And that's when the mandatory catalogs came in. Now, I said they were helpful in one way. They were a pain in the neck in another, because as soon as you changed a course, you had to reprint the catalog. So it ended up slowing down the process of revising curricula, because you had to go through the university process, and the university process had to include that printing, and to start with, you had to have a print catalog. That, of course, uh, changed to online. So we sort of traded one bear for another. And then currently, I obviously haven't participated in the accreditation process now for a while. So some of the outside influence is probably lessened. Uh, U.S. Office of Education has a little less clout. But internally, as you know, our big bugaboo is, are we going to require entry level at the doctorate level only? Right now, we still have the choice, although most of the programs are graduating to doctorate level entry. So we have gone in the space of, really just a little over 100 years to 6 weeks without any requirement of university or college or even high school. Simply a 6 weeks training program, period, full stop, to requiring a doctorate at the university education level. So you can see there's a little change in thinking and strategy and positioning along the way. The biggest support for the doctoral level entry is that then when you're in a team meeting, your title is also doctor, even though it's not medical doctor. And of course, a great many people say titles don't always tell you what the individual is capable of doing. So we've gone from worrying whether you knew your crafts to worrying whether you can function in a team meeting with other people who have doctorates.
Mhm.
That's my one sentence summary.
I think that's a great summary. I mean, that's a lot of changes over the years. That's a lot.
Yeah. So, at any given time, in other words, when you look at the history of OT, as I've commented, you not only have to know what the society was doing at the time, but you have to understand where our thinking was about ourselves and what the arguments were at any given time. Said when we went from "Do you know how to knit?" Or how to pour ceramic molds to "Do you understand the concept of therapeutic occupation?" Not just filling somebody's time, to being able to function in a team setting with other people, all have doctorates and all have their own territories. So, and we really have to keep paying attention, to what is the critical process.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Reed, for sharing all of this information with us today. It was incredibly informative. I think there's something so interesting about looking at occupational therapy education across time. While the settings, standards, and credentials have evolved, many of the core questions have remained the same. As we reflect on these themes, we're reminded that today's educational standards are a part of a much larger story, one shaped by those who built programs, challenged assumptions, and worked to define what it means to enter this profession. In our next episode, we'll turn to Dr. Reed's time at Texas Women's University and explore the role that institutions, mentorship, and scholarship play in shaping both practitioners and the profession itself. Join us as we continue on preserving our past, informing our future.